Okay, it's been a while since we've done a full crop specific episode, and I think this is the perfect time of the year to talk tomatoes. We are getting about 500 tomato plants in the ground over the next week, so the conditions of the soil and the air conditions are on my mind at the moment, along with how to trellis and prune those guys as well. I don't do as much with my tomatoes as some other people do, but what I do is pretty consistent from year to year. So, today on Just Grow Something, we're going totally tomatoes, where they originated, the nutritional benefits, what types of soil conditions they prefer, trellising, pruning, pests, diseases, all the things. You will walk away from this episode with all the knowledge to tackle this much loved veggie. Well, fruit, actually. Let's dig in.
Hey, I'm Karen, and what started as a small backyard garden 20 years ago turned into a lifelong passion for growing food. Now, as a market farmer and horticulturist, I want to help you do the same. On this podcast, I am your friend in the garden, teaching evidence-based techniques to help you grow your favorites and build confidence in your own garden space. So grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something.
So there's a lot to cover on tomatoes, so let's just dig right into it this week. The scientific name for tomato is Solanum lycopersicum. So of course it's part of the Solanaceae family, also known as the nightshades. This family also includes a lot of our familiar friends in the garden like peppers and eggplant and potatoes, but also some stubborn weeds as well, like horse nettle and eastern black nightshade and jimson weed, and even some very notorious ones like belladonna. Yes, your summer salsa shares a family tree with deadly nightshade. It's not just a good idea to know the plant family something is in, because it can give us some idea about its familial traits, but it's also good to know where a plant originated from, because it gives us a clue as to what its ideal climate is. Tomatoes originated in Central and South America, so warm climates with steady rainfall and mild winters. That origin gives us a clue. Tomatoes like warmth, they like sunlight, and they like consistent moisture, right? So if we want to be successful with tomatoes, then we might need to be recreating those conditions in our own gardens. And yes, let's just clear it up right away. Tomatoes are technically a fruit, even a berry, actually, since their seeds are on the inside. But because they're not sweet, we use them like a vegetable culinarily. I don't know anyone using tomatoes in their fruit salad. If you are, we need to have a talk. So, as far as tomatoes' nutrition is concerned, they are made up of about 95% water with a little bit of carbohydrates and some trace amounts of fat and protein. They are low in calories, so 18 calories per 100 grams, and they are packed with nutrients like vitamin C and potassium, vitamin K1, and folate. They are also full of antioxidants, most notably lycopene. That is the compound that gives tomatoes their red color, and it's often touted for heart health and prostate support. There's also beta carotene and chlorogenic acid, and then there's a compound in the skin called naringenin, which is a polyphenol that likely has some anti inflammatory effects. But not everything about the tomato is helpful. The green parts, so the leaves and the stems, actually contain toxic alkaloids, and ingesting those can cause symptoms from stomach upset to much worse in rare instances, which is why I think I've never had a problem with small rodents or anything eating my baby tomato transplants like I have with my pepper transplants. But the deer do seem to not have a problem eating the tomato plants sometimes. So I'm not sure how that's working out for the deer. So just don't you go snacking on tomato leaves. And tomatoes are a warm season crop. They like the heat. They absolutely cannot handle frost. So, in northern climates, we want to wait until all danger of frost has passed and the soil temperatures are at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15.5 Celsius. We actually ideally want them a little bit closer to 70 Fahrenheit or 21.1 Celsius. That's even better for reducing transplant shock and making sure that they take off growing right away. We also want to wait until the overnight air temperatures are staying above 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius. It's not going to cause obvious damage to the plant tissues if the temperatures drop, down into the 40s. but it will absolutely slow their growth. And there can actually be long term effects that aren't as obvious. So, there have been studies that show if the overnight temperatures drop down just 1 degree Celsius to 9 Celsius or down to 48.2 Fahrenheit for 9 nights in a row. They specifically looked at this time frame, then the ability of the plant to photosynthesize is permanently reduced. So its photosynthetic rate, which is how the plant gets energy to grow and produce fruit from the sun, is irreversibly reduced. Now, that's if the temperatures are low like that for more than a week. But we also know that for every hour that the air temperatures are below that 50-degree Fahrenheit, it takes an increased amount of time for the plant to recover its functions. So we don't want to rush and put our tomato plants out in the garden until, like, we don't see any nights any cooler than 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the forecast, and the soil temperatures are at least like 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18.3 Celsius before we put them out. You might choose to put them out sooner, and that's fine. Just know that they may get off to a slower start. So if you can wait, I suggest it. Now, sometimes, obviously, maybe we start our plants too early and they start to get leggy, and we need to get them out into the garden, and that's fine. Just know that you are also not going to get any higher of a yield or any earlier of a yield by putting them out earlier. So we have done the tests here. We have plants that we put out, tomato plants that went out in late April, and then we also set tomato plants out 3 weeks later around mid-May. And all of those plants began producing at the same time. The ones that went in earlier did not start producing any earlier than the ones that went out in May. And the mid-May transplanted plants looked much healthier overall. We didn't measure the yield, but I really should repeat that experiment to see if the yield was any different. But for sure, there was no difference in terms of when they started producing. So, tomato plants do need at least 6 hours of sunlight a day. Ideally, we're looking at 8 to 10, preferably. So, if you are gardening somewhere where you're getting sort of a lot of part shade in your garden, just know that, even if it's broken up, so you get like 4 hours in the morning and then 4 hours in the afternoon, and you have a break during the middle of the day, that's okay. It all counts. It's all cumulative, right? So, if you have a particularly shady spot in your yard and you're trying to grow tomatoes and you really aren't quite hitting that 6 hour mark, maybe consider doing them in containers and being able to move them around a little bit as the season progresses to the sunniest parts of your yard if you can. And we'll talk about how to do that with containers here in a minute. Um, you may also, if you're in a hot southern climate in the northern hemisphere, you might actually benefit from some afternoon shade that is actually really helpful to those plants in the extreme heat. They might be, heat lovers, but they have, there is some limit to what they'll tolerate. They like it warm, but they didn't originate like in the desert, so there is a limit. You may also, in those climates, consider growing determinate tomatoes in two separate successions. So one in the early spring and then another one late into the fall, to just avoid the hottest part of the year when it's actually too hot for tomatoes. Because once they get over a certain temperature, air temperature wise, tomatoes will actually stop producing. They'll either drop their blooms or they will stop ripening the tomatoes. So if you can avoid those really hot times in those southern areas, then you might be better off. If you are starting seeds indoors, tomatoes like soil temperatures for germination between 65 and 85 Fahrenheit, preferably closer to that 85-degree range. I get questioned about this a lot when it comes to, seed germination temperatures and why they are often listed so much higher than like the preferred soil temperature for transplants. Because remember, we said, we want a minimum of 60 degrees Fahrenheit for the transplants to go into the garden. Why would we not want that soil at a much warmer temperature, which would be similar to what the germination temperature would be? If you think about how a seed would naturally occur out in the wild, basically, if you have tomatoes that drop their fruit, okay, an overripe fruit. The whole idea of producing fruit is to reproduce, right? So the tomato is going to drop its fruit on the ground. That's going to disintegrate. Those tomato seeds are going to be right there within that, top layer of the soil. Well, what happens with that top layer of soil in the spring? That top, inch or even 2 inches is getting warmer in the spring much more quickly than the soil, between the 2 and 4 inch range. So it's going to be closer to that 85 degrees Fahrenheit during the day in the early part of the spring versus the soil further down, which is going to take longer to warm up. So as those roots go down, they're actually going towards that cooler soil, but they like that warmer temperature at the top to actually germinate. So this is why when we're starting seeds indoors, we generally like to use those heat mats because we're mimicking what is actually going to happen outdoors, where the soil temperature at the top at germination point is much warmer, but then those roots are going down into that slightly cooler soil. So just think, when you're planting your seeds or when you're starting them indoors, those seeds should be planted about 1/4 of an inch deep and just keep them nice and moist. And again, if you have those higher temperatures, that's also very important, making sure they're in contact with that wet soil all the time, or damp soil, I should say. And then once they sprout, they do need lots of light. We say they need 6 hours a day to grow while they're out in the garden, but ideally if we can provide them with more than that when they are growing indoors, so closer to like 12 to 14 hours a day, even as much as 18 hours a day from a grow light, then that's going to be better. And I know that can be a bit much for beginners, which is why a lot of gardeners just want to buy their starts at the garden center. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Don't feel like you have to go and start your own tomatoes from seed. The benefit to starting your own tomatoes from seed, though, is that you get to choose from a whole wide range of varieties that you likely are not going to find in, a garden, in a nursery, in a big box store, any of those places. So if you are interested in trying a bunch of different types of varieties, or you are looking for specific traits, in general, you are likely going to want to start your own tomatoes indoors. And part of this is tomato types fall into two main categories of growth. We have determinate and we have indeterminate. So, determinate, or like bush varieties, will grow to about 2 to 3 feet tall, and they produce most of their fruit over a short period of time. So these are really great if you want to can or make sauce all at once. You don't want to have to continue to do a bunch of batches throughout the year. They also don't require staking, and so they're very ideal for containers and small spaces. And again, if you are in a very, very warm climate where the center or the middle part of the summer is just way too hot for growing tomatoes, you can use a determinate tomato very early in the season to get your first batch of tomatoes, and then pull those tomato plants out, making space for something else during the hottest part of the season, and then plant another batch of them later on towards the fall when your temperatures start to cool a little bit, but timing it to where it's still warm enough for them to grow. And that way you're getting two different batches essentially of tomatoes. You don't want to prune determinate tomatoes though, because that is going to reduce the number of fruiting points on the plant. And since they only produce those points over a short period of time, that will reduce your overall yield. So some determinate varieties, like in the slicing kind of tomato category, are things like Celebrity or Rutgers or Betterbush. And then a lot of your sauce and paste tomatoes, like your Romas and your San Marzanos, are also determinates. On the other side of this, we have indeterminates. These are your vining type varieties, okay? So they will keep growing and keep producing all season long until you get to your first frost. So think about like your cherry tomatoes and how wild and crazy cherry tomatoes can grow, or your beefsteak tomatoes, right? These guys all do need staking or caging, and this is for a number of reasons. Number one, you want to kind of have a way to support that longer growth and that heavier load of fruit, but also it keeps that fruit up off the ground where it can be bruised, or critters have more access to them, etc. So these are the ones that you generally want to make sure that you are staking or caging, and we'll talk about how to do that here in a minute. Now, there is actually a third type that isn't always differentiated a lot of the time, and it's called indeterminate short internode, or ISI. These are bush types of tomatoes that are also indeterminate. So they keep growing and producing all season long. But the difference between, your regular vining indeterminate and these ISIs is that these ones have shorter internodes. So the internode is that space between the nodes on the stem where the leaves are attached. So rather than being, spaced a certain distance apart like the vining types, they're shorter, which means that they have a bushier growth habit, which is more similar to a bush type or a determinate. But unlike a determinate, that only produces all of its fruit sort of all at once over the span of a few weeks, these ISIs will actually produce all season long. So, one variety that we grow here for our customers specifically to be able to grow in containers on their patio is called Husky Red. But there's also Perth's Pride and Sleeping Lady and Dwarf Wild Fred, yeah. So even though they have a compact growth habit, though, these you do actually want to stake or use a cage or something, because that indeterminate fruit production will mean that it gets heavy enough with fruit over the season to sort of be top heavy. And so, you want to prevent it from falling over. You also don't want to prune ISI plants other than to clear out dead or diseased foliage around the base of the plant for airflow. And we'll talk more on pruning here in a minute. One of the reasons that I love Heirloom Roses as a company is because they are a family business. They're owned by Ben and Kara Hanna, located in the fertile Willamette Valley in Oregon, just an hour away from my alma mater, Oregon State University. Ben and Kara are continuing the legacy of John and Louise Clements, who founded the nursery back in 1973, which incidentally was the year I was born, so the company's been doing this for as long as I have been alive. In fact, the Heirloom Roses offices are still located in the farmhouse where John and Louise lived on the property. They're not just passionate about hand propagating each rose, they also value the preservation of unique and rare roses. They are committed to providing own root roses that provide tons of blooms, are winter hardy, disease resistant, and true to variety. Own root roses cannot be produced very quickly like grafted roses, but the difference in the quality is worth it. Get your own beautiful roses directly from their farm in St. Paul, Oregon by going to heirloomroses.com and using code JUSTGROW at checkout to save 20% on your order. Heirloomroses.com with code JUSTGROW at checkout. The link is in the show notes. So let's talk about the difference between growing tomatoes in ground versus growing them like in pots or containers. So if you are planting in the ground or using like raised planters, it's generally recommended that you space your plants about 2 to 3 feet apart so that they get enough airflow and sunlight. The one thing I will say is if you are trellising your tomatoes either on a panel or by using the string method, and we'll go into all that here in a minute, it is possible to plant them more closely together. So anywhere between 12 and 18 inches is actually possible so long as you have that really good soil fertility and you are doing some pruning. So just know that if you feel like you don't have enough room for the number of tomato plants that you want to grow, the way that you trellis them may make the difference, and also the way that you prune them. But when it comes to, that soil fertility, we want to make sure that we are adding good compost or organic matter to the soil. And then if you want to add, bone meal or a tomato specific fertilizer at planting or around planting time to support that root and flower development, that's a really good idea. Don't go heavy on the nitrogen. Too much nitrogen is going to give you like a lot of leafy green, but not so much in terms of the flowering and the fruiting. So remember, we want the phosphorus and the potassium for supporting that flowering and fruiting. So, a standard amount of nitrogen is fine if you're using, say, a balanced fertilizer that's like a 10-10-10, Or you can do something that is higher with that middle number and that last number, so like a 10, 15, 10, to get more of the phosphorus in there. And then a quick tip for transplanting. Remember we talked about, maybe having leggy plants that maybe got away from you and you started them too early or you waited too late to get them in the ground. Tomato plants are very, very forgiving when it comes to planting. If they've gotten really leggy, right, you can lay them on their side, sort of in a trench, and then just leave that top part of the stem out of the ground, and they will take off just fine. Tomatoes will grow roots all along their stems wherever they are in contact with the soil. So even if they're not leggy, if you can dig a nice deeper hole and plant them deeper into that hole, and just leave those few inches at the top of the plant, that is really going to help them establish a nice, strong root system. So this is not one of those plants where we want to take them from the pot and put them in the soil and plant them at the same depth as the soil depth in the container. We want to get them as deep as possible, okay? And so again, if your seedlings are leggy, you can use this to your advantage by laying them in a shallow trench and then just burying the stem sideways. I will say that unless you are growing determinate varieties, you want to stake or cage your tomatoes at the same time that you are planting them. Do not wait to do this. This is the voice of experience speaking to you right now. Unless you are just doing a single stake that is going to go right next to the stem of the plant, once they're growing, it is really, really difficult to try to add that support later on, and you can actually end up damaging the plant. So if you're using cages, get your tomato plant in the ground and then put the cage over top of it right away. If you are doing, fence trellises, or if you're doing the string methods, make sure that all of your apparatus are there and in place before you go and plant your tomatoes. You don't want to be doing this after they've already started growing. Now, if you're using containers, we're looking at preferably something that's a 20-inch top, with some really good drainage holes. So usually this is something at least like in the 5-gallon range, but 10-gallon is even better. If you're doing 5-gallon, make sure that you are, doing probably a determinate tomato that is a bit smaller, or one of those ISIs. You definitely want to use a good quality potting mix, possibly mixing in some compost or other organic matter into there. These are plants that are going to be in place in this for a very extended period of time, so you want to make sure that the soil fertility is there. So not only is this going to help with the soil fertility, but it's also hopefully going to help with some water retention, because containers can dry out faster than like our in-ground garden beds or even our raised planters. So number one, we want something in that container that's going to help retain the moisture, but just understand that you're likely going to need to water more often, especially during heat waves. We do want to stick with those less frequent, more thorough waterings. Okay, that still applies here. But you don't want the container to get bone dry before you water it, because that stresses the plant out, and it can also make your soil hydrophobic, meaning when you do finally go and water it, then the water might just float across the top and it might not soak in quite as way. So make sure that you are, paying attention to its watering needs. And again, if you're doing these in pots, you likely want to stick with the bush or the dwarf varieties unless you are ready to really stake some sort of a monster vine in a pot. This is even more important if you plan to move the pot around. So, like I mentioned earlier, if you have a problem with your garden becoming shaded at certain points of the season and you don't think you're going to have enough sun, make it to where you are planting a bush or a dwarf variety in a container that you can move. You can follow the sun as it continues around during the season. This is one way to kind of get around that. So, when we're talking trellising and pruning, two practices that can make a huge difference in your plant health, your harvest quality, and your ease of maintenance, okay? Trellising and pruning. Let's talk trellising first. Why does it matter? Trellising helps to keep your tomato plants upright. Okay, so this keeps the plants, or it keeps the fruit off of the ground. So that reduces the possibility of rot. It's also going to reduce the possibility of disease and also damage from things like slugs or rabbits that can grab onto it very easily when they're close to the ground. Your upright plants are less likely to break in the wind, especially when they are loaded down with heavy fruit. So that's going to support your harvest a little bit more. And it also increases air circulation, which is going to help prevent fungal diseases like early blight. This is really important if you live someplace like where I do, where it gets very, very humid. And it just seems like the disease just wants to hang in the air and it wants to attach itself to our tomato plants. So, staking or trellising in some way actually helps to accomplish all of those things. Do all tomatoes need a trellis? No, not necessarily. We already talked the determinate type, so all those bush or patio tomatoes generally stay compact enough and don't require support, although it is still helpful during heavy fruiting. Um, Indeterminate tomatoes, again, they grow and produce all season. They really do need some support for their best yield and their best health. So, what are some different ways that we can do this? The first one that you likely are familiar with is those tomato cages. These are fine for, smaller gardens if you are growing fewer than 10 plants because they can be kind of pricey. The square cages are really nice because they have like solid, four sides around them, which makes it, a little bit more sturdy than the round ones that kind of taper at the bottom. Just make sure really what it is that they're tall enough, okay? Especially for indeterminate varieties. They can be a little flimsy if you don't get the right ones, and they have very, very inexpensive ones. So if you are growing more than 10 plants, then you might be tempted to buy the kind of cheap ones, but just know that if you're growing an indeterminate variety and they get particularly vigorous, it's probably going to outgrow that cage. You likely are going to have them coming up and over the side and, vines going out all over the place. So just be aware that you might need to prune more frequently if you've got a cage. The next option would be individual stakes. So putting a single stake next to each plant, basically right at the stem, and then loosely tying that main stem as it grows. This is very simple. It is fairly effective depending on the size of the stake. Again, we want to base that on the size of our tomato plant, especially if we are doing an indeterminate. It can be time consuming if you have a large number of plants to go through and do this, but it is effective, and we do it here in a lot of the beds where we may not have permanent trellising attached. The next one would be a fence trellis, so a vertical structure of some sort. Our favorite thing to do is a cattle panel on T-posts, and I like to leave them in place. This lets you tie tomatoes to this very sturdy frame. So we can actually space our tomatoes much more closely together because they're being planted at the base of this cattle panel. And I can tie it up very effectively and control that growth habit as it goes up. The bonus about this too is if you have these types of sturdy, sturdy trellises in place all the time, you can reuse it for other vining crops. So one year you might grow, peas on that trellis, or maybe, pole beans. And well, that's a legume. It's fixing nitrogen into the soil. And so the next season you could do tomatoes there because the tomatoes can take advantage of that nitrogen for its early growth. And then maybe the next season you can do cucumbers, right? All in different seasons. So we're rotating those plant families like we like to do, and we're using that same trellis over and over again. So if you can invest in a really good fence type trellis, then that's the way that I recommend doing it because, that's how we do it and it works really well for us. There is also the Florida weave. So this is another way to do it. I have done this in the past. Not sure if I'm doing it this year because we sort of moved fields where we're doing all of our tomatoes, but it is very effective. So, and this is really ideal for you if you have rows of tomatoes. So essentially what you're doing is you're driving stakes between every few plants, and then you are weaving twine around the stakes and around the tomato plants, kind of in and out as you go down, and then back the same, back come up the other direction and do the same thing on the opposite side of each of those plants. So essentially you are sandwiching the plants in between these strings of twine. And You just add more layers of that, of the twine, as the plants grow taller. It's very efficient and it's very scalable. If you are growing a lot of plants and you're doing them in rows, it is a very, very effective way to get them strung up, so to say. You just have to make sure that on either end you have something very sturdy to sort of anchor the twine that you're tying off, so that your rows don't kind of flip flop around. So if you're using you know fairly skinny stakes in between the plants as you go, every so often you want to have a really heavy duty one, so either a T-post or a larger stake or something like that. But it is a very, very effective way. It takes a little practice and you definitely have to keep up on it, but it is very effective. And then, of course, there is also the overhead string trellis, and you can do the lower and lean method with this as well. So this is a little bit more advanced, but I have seen a lot of home gardeners start to do this, and it's very effective. It's really good for maximizing your yield in a very small space. And essentially what you're doing is that you're creating an overhead support of some sort, and then you are dangling strings. That strings are hanging from that overhead support. And so the plants are tied to those strings as they grow. Now, you can just do that and call it good. That's the way that they grow all season long. Or if you want to make it a little bit easier on yourself, or if you have a very, very long growing season and your tomatoes are going to get very, very tall, you do the lower and lean method, which is very popular in commercial greenhouses. So essentially, you're removing the lower leaves as the plant, is the production, ceases at the lower part of the plant. You just start to strip those leaves off, and then you like lower those plants on the string, let them kind of lean down sideways. So now that's all touching the ground. That whole bare section on the bottom of the plant is touching the ground, and the top part continues to grow upward. It's very difficult to describe. You'll have to go look it up. If you just look at the lower and lean method, you will see what I'm talking about. But this is very effective if you, again, have a small space, or you don't want to put any kind of a permanent trellis in place. It's very effective. It just takes some practice, but it is really good for maximizing your yield, especially if you have a small space. Now, what about pruning? Okay. Um, should you bother pruning? This is the age-old question. And I will let you in on a little secret. I very rarely prune my tomatoes anymore. Okay. So basically the short answer is it's optional. Okay. Yes, pruning can improve your airflow, which is actually going to help you reduce disease. So I absolutely recommend pruning if you live someplace where diseases are prevalent, especially, again, places like here where it gets very, very humid. But I tend to prune just like the lower, probably 12 inches or so of the plant, to keep any debris from splashing up out of the soil and causing soil-borne diseases. And then I will just remove what branches and leaves seem to either be obstructing the airflow a little bit. I don't really do it strategically in terms of, pinching off the suckers. If you prune, it also is likely going to increase your fruit size, but it does not mean you're going to get more fruit. You're actually reducing the number of fruit that you're getting. So it's kind of like, if you picture the fact that this plant has a certain amount of energy that it can put into fruiting, right? And you either are going to give it the opportunity to produce a bunch of smaller fruits, or prune it to where it gives you fewer but much larger fruits, okay? It can also encourage earlier ripening too, depending on the variety that you're growing. But skipping pruning does not mean that your plants are going to fail. Again, I don't do a ton of pruning because I mentioned we're planting 500 some odd tomato plants. And in addition to everything else that goes on in these gardens, I don't have time to be out there pruning all the time. You just need to remember that you only prune indeterminate tomatoes. If you prune the determinate types, you're going to reduce your yield because they only produce a fixed number of flowers and fruits, okay? It is also very normal for the lower leaves to yellow and fall off, especially for determinate plants as that fruit matures. So don't worry about that in your determinants. You're not doing anything wrong. So only prune your indeterminate tomatoes. The Essentially, when you're pruning, you have a couple of things. First off, early on, if your plant is fairly small when you plant them, it's generally recommended that you pinch off the flowers until that plant is at least 12 to 18 inches tall. We want to build a good, strong root system. We want that energy being focused on root development and not on flowering and fruiting. This is, especially if you have a very, very large tomato, that you're growing in terms of fruit size. Again, this is not something you do with a determinate, you only on the indeterminates, okay? And then once it starts flowering and fruiting and you allow it to start to develop its fruit, you want to remove the suckers, okay? So the suckers, and it took me a long time to figure out what people meant by suckers because in terms of like fruit trees and things like that, suckers are what come from the base of the plant that continue to grow up. But when we're talking about tomatoes, the suckers are the small shoots that grow in the joint between the main stem and a leaf branch. Okay. So, and it's very easy to just pinch those off when they're very small. You can just pinch them with your fingers. Okay, now if you don't do this, those again eventually become fruiting points and you're going to have more fruit coming out of there. So if you are focusing on getting larger fruits, then yes, absolutely remove those suckers. If you're not that concerned about it, then you're getting more fruit out of those suckers, but they're just going to be smaller fruits. Okay. Then you can also, again, remove those lower leaves as the plant gets taller and the fruits ripen, because that is going to improve the airflow near the base. And of course, this is absolutely crucial if you are trying to avoid diseases. So, what kind of pests do we have to worry about with tomatoes? The first thing, probably earliest in the season, is tomato cutworm. They may actually eat the stem of the tomato plant and kind of cuts through the stem completely in some cases. You walk out, and it's very similar to what you see in any other type of a plant. You walk out, and your perfectly healthy little tomato seedling is now laying flat on its side, like something snipped it at the soil level. That is generally a cutworm. So, you can wait until your tomato plants are larger and it's more difficult for the cutworm to be able to cut through the stem of the tomato plant, or you can put collars around the base of the plant to help prevent them from getting to the stem at all, because they actually might also climb up the stem and feed on the leaves. If they can't cut through the stem. So a collar is a good idea if you know that you have had cutworms. Aphids, too, can tend to be a problem in tomatoes. They're generally only a problem if you have them in abundance, because they will cause yellow curling leaves and they've got this white sticky residue, the honeydew that they leave behind. If you are promoting a really good ecosystem in your garden and you are interplanting things like we talked about before, you likely are also going to be drawing in some of those good bugs that are actually going to take care of the aphids for you. Never have I had a problem with such a horrible infestation of aphids that it started causing problems with my plants before the ladybugs moved in to try to help take care of that problem. So don't panic if you see aphids right away. Now, you can just spray them off with a hose, okay? They oftentimes are fairly easy to just knock down that population by spraying them off really well and waiting for those ladybugs to start to to show up. But if you're not noticing any of the lady beetles or any of their larvae, which if you've never seen lady beetle larvae, they look like tiny little orange and black alligators. They're very cool looking. But the first time I saw one, I had no idea if it was a good bug or a bad bug. So just know that those are your lady beetle or ladybug larvae, and they are voracious eaters of aphids. If you notice, though, that you have aphids in addition to having a ton of ants, Just know that ants will farm aphids like livestock in order to feed on the honeydew that the aphids leave behind. So at that point, you definitely want to be kind of spraying things down just to kind of get rid of them and hope for the best. Um, but of course, if that doesn't work, then, you can use some insecticidal soap, directly on the insects on the plant to get rid of them. Flea beetles are a problem, especially in younger plants. Usually, if you've gotten the plant, beyond its kind of seedling or juvenile stage, then the flea beetles, even if they are there and causing damage, they're not going to cause so much damage that it causes a problem with the plant's production. Flea beetles are usually more of a problem when the plant is younger because they cause those holes in the leaves, and of course that interrupts the photosynthesis process, which is going to interrupt how well that plant grows in the beginning. So that's one thing to be aware of. And of course, there is the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm. They're both the same. They cause that defoliation on your tomatoes. Those are those big, thick, nasty green tomatoes that have what looks like a horn on the end of them. They will do some damage. You can walk out the next day and see just plants completely stripped of their leaves if you don't pay attention to what's going on. And you can usually see the signs of the hornworm before you start to see that they are completely defoliating your plants, because you'll see their droppings. So the tomato hornworm frass is kind of very distinctive looking. It's black, almost looks square, to be honest with you. If you look up pictures of this, you will know, if you see that you have hornworms. Interesting fact, if you go out into your garden with a black light at night, tomato hornworms will glow in the dark. And so they're a lot easier to pick off when you can see them when they're glowing in the dark. White flies are also a problem in tomatoes. They can, also leave behind a sticky white residue, but generally speaking, if you have white flies, you're going to know it because as soon as you move that plant, they just all fly up. And then leaf miners, those are also an issue. You're going to see that kind of tunnel or zigzag pattern on the leaves. And then, of course, we have corn earworms, which is also known as the tomato fruitworm, which is why we generally don't like to plant corn near our tomatoes, because they share a host. They're both a host for the same pest. And stink bugs and slugs, those can all, cause holes in your fruit once they start producing. So with all of these pests, you generally want to monitor your tomato plants on a daily basis. Checking underneath the leaves is a really good idea. Check the fruit, check around your soil, make sure that you are able to identify the problem insects in your area. So your university extension is a really good place to start looking for that information to find out what tomato pests are in your area. And then you can find out what the natural predators are for those pests so that you recognize what those look like in your garden, and okay, this is a good bug, this is one that I don't want, and you're not, doing away with the bugs that you actually want to have there. Again, if you can dislodge the pests just by spraying your plants down with a really good jet stream from the hose, this is a nice step, especially, for things like aphids that take a while to actually cause damage. But you can be hand picking insects too, those bigger things like the tomato hornworms. Get yourself a pair of gloves and, a bucket of soapy water or a cup of soapy water, and just walk through and pick those guys off and toss them in the soapy water. You can also use that insecticidal soap directly on the insects on the plant. This works especially well for smaller pests like aphids and, even spider mites or other types of things. Um, Horticultural oils or sprays diluted in water, neem oil sprays, are also good to use here too. If, as a last resort, you choose to use an actual synthetic insecticide, keep in mind that you might also be, damaging the beneficial insects as well. Just make sure that you are following the directions on the label. The label is the law, and we do not want to underuse or overuse these things because we don't want to develop resistant insects. So those are all the buggies. What about the diseases and other problems? Okay, early blight. This is a fungal disease that causes leaves to drop. It is very common after rainfall or in very humid areas like ours. It starts with these dark concentric spots on the leaves. They're like brown to black. They're about a half an inch in diameter, and it's usually on the lower leaves and the stems. If you catch it early and you destroy the infected leaves, your plant is likely to survive. Late blight is another fungal disease that causes gray, moldy spots on the leaves and the fruit, which will later turn brown. It is spread and supported also by persistent damp weather. This is especially true if you have your plants in the ground already and you're having like a cool, wet spring. You very likely might see some late blight. Powdery mildew is another fungal disease. It leaves those white spots or a dusting of white on the leaves. It definitely can be managed. Again, it's more prevalent when it's damp out, but I have successfully used First Saturday Lime or milk sprays or baking soda on the leaf surfaces. And with a lot of these fungal ones, this will work to help kind of combat it because you're changing the pH of the surface of the leaves, and it's less likely that those funguses can survive outside of their like typical pH range. So anything that you can do to change that pH of the surface of the leaf or the plant, the more likely you're going to be able to combat these fungal diseases. Now, not everything is like fungal. We have mosaic virus, okay? So it creates distorted leaves and it causes the young growth to be narrowed and kind of twisted and gnarly, and then the leaves become mottled with yellow. And unfortunately, there is nothing that you can do about mosaic virus. You will need to destroy the plants. You have to pull the entire plant and destroy it. Do not put it in your compost pile. Get rid of it in some other way because there is no way to fix mosaic virus, and it will very quickly move from the actual plant tissues itself into the fruits, and the fruits are unedible. So there's really no helping a plant that ends up with mosaic virus. And it's called mosaic virus because you can see this sort of mottled mosaic pattern on the leaves out of that yellow color, so that you'll know if it's mosaic virus. Fusarium wilt. This starts with yellowing and wilting generally on one side of the plant, and then it moves up the plant as the fungus spreads. And again, unfortunately, this is another one where, once the plant has it, it needs to be destroyed because there is no fixing it. What you can fix is blossom end rot, sort of, okay? Blossom end rot is caused by a calcium imbalance. So this causes the bottom side of the tomato to develop a like dark sunken spot. Now, blossom end rot is not just in tomatoes. You can get this in your summer squashes and all kinds of other plants that aren't getting a proper amount of calcium. It does not necessarily mean that you don't have enough calcium in your soil. Calcium is notoriously slow to move, whether it's through the soil or through the plant itself, and it can be kind of thrown off by a lot of different things, right? Really inconsistent rainfall can cause calcium to move more slowly or to be less available to your plants. So don't assume that because you've got blossom end rot that you have a calcium deficiency. It is just a calcium imbalance. It's very rare for soils to actually be calcium deficient. Now, can you do something to help with this? Well, number one, if it's a matter of your watering practices, that might be part of it. If you're watering infrequently or you're inconsistently, I should say, then that might cause a problem with the calcium imbalance. So you might have to adjust your watering practices. If you don't irrigate like we don't, but we mostly rely on Mother Nature's rainfall for the water needs of the plant, then we make sure that we mulch really, really well. So whatever moisture we do get gets trapped in that soil for an extended period of time, and again, less likely to have calcium issues. There is also, soil amendments that you can add that are liquid that will immediately deliver that calcium to the plant when it needs it. It makes it a bit easier for it to go because it's like water soluble, and it's there's a bunch of different liquid versions of these things that you can add if you're really seeing a problem. But in most instances, it generally resolves itself once the weather conditions change or the soil conditions, change as the season goes on. So don't immediately start amending and throwing calcium at the problem. If you start to see blossom end rot, give it a little bit of time to see if it corrects itself. If there's anything you can do to help correct it in terms of watering, then great. And then speaking of watering, the other thing too that you might see in tomatoes is cracking. So when the fruit grows too quickly, the skin is going to crack. You get these openings. This is especially a problem in cherry tomatoes because they're so small. When they crack, they basically burst open. But this is also common in your regular slicing tomatoes. This usually occurs because again, uneven moisture, whether it's from water, weather conditions, or it's from your uneven watering. If you have very rainy periods mixed in with really, really dry periods, then all of a sudden that fruit is taking up all of that water and it's bursting at the seams, quite literally. So again, we want to just kind of see if we can keep our moisture levels consistent here, either with consistent watering. It doesn't mean daily. Remember, less frequent, more thorough, but we want it consistent. So, do a test to see how long it takes for your soil to dry out down, deeper, and then soak it really good and then let it dry out and soak it and let it dry out. You don't want it to get bone dry, but you also don't want to be watering every single day the top 1 or 2 inches because that's not good for your plant either. If you're relying on rainfall, then mulch is going to be your friend. Mulch, mulch, mulch. I always say mulch for a myriad of reasons, but in this instance, it's for helping to water or manage your water. And then finally, let's talk about the harvest and storage of your tomatoes. One of the beautiful things about homegrown tomatoes is being able to leave them on the vine as long as possible and have that just beautifully juicy, ripe, warmed by the sun summer tomato. However, it is not necessary to leave them on the vine that long in order to be able to get that full tomato flavor, especially if you have problems with critters. Squirrels notoriously, go out there and wait until it's, just the right time to pick those tomatoes off and take a big old bite out of it, right? Raccoons, we've had problems with raccoons stripping our tomatoes off of our vines. So it also, the riper or the more ripe a tomato fruit gets, the less firm it is. And so it actually makes it easier for some of those insect pests to get into there too. So you can harvest your tomatoes when they are still firm, you want to, and you can, look at their color to see when it's time to ripen them. Okay, so whether it's bunnies or it's insect pests or birds or whatever, you might want to get to it before it gets fully colored up. So we're talking about when they are first starting to blush. So when they just start to turn the correct color on the bottom of the fruit. And I say correct color because there's so many varieties out there. You've got yellow, you've got green tomatoes. I mean, like green when they're ripe. You've purple tomatoes, in addition to the red and the orange. So just know what color it's supposed to be. And as that tomato starts to turn the right color on the bottom of the fruit, then you can go ahead and harvest them. I promise you, they are still going to taste absolutely fantastic. Just bring them in and let them sit in a warm area in your kitchen to just finish coloring up. Do not place them in a sunny windowsill to ripen, okay? Because they might actually rot before they are ripe if they get that sort of direct sunlight coming in through the windowsill. So just a warm space in your kitchen, not necessarily in the direct sunlight. This also means that if you have gotten all the way through the season and it's getting close to frost, and you have a ton of tomatoes out there on your plant, and the temperatures are starting to drop, and of course your tomatoes aren't ripening at this point, then you can do one of two things. You can either pull the entire plant and just kind of brush off the dirt, remove all the foliage, but leave the fruit, and then just hang the plant upside down in your basement or your garage. It will continue to ripen up those fruits using the energy stores that are still in that plant. You also can just pick any of the mature pale green tomatoes. So when tomatoes just get ready to start ripening up, they go from that real dark solid green color to start to be like a pale green. they're mature at that point, but they're just still green. So you can store those stem side up in a paper bag or wrap them loosely in newspaper and put them in a cardboard box and then just store them in a cool space somewhere between 55 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the dark. And the cooler on the, the cooler side of those temperatures, it's going to slow the ripening a little bit warmer on the, the 70-degree side, they're going to speed up that ripening. You just check them every week and pull out the ones that are ripe, and if any of them start to get soft or, spotted, then, you get rid of those. But that's one way that you can harvest tomatoes towards the end of the season if they're not ready to, if they're not ripening. Just don't ever refrigerate your tomatoes. Temperatures below 55 Fahrenheit actually destroy the enzymes that give tomatoes their flavor, and it can actually ruin the texture. So, obviously, if you've only eaten half of one, then you need to cover it and put it in the fridge to keep it from spoiling. But just know the second half of that tomato is not going to taste as good as the first half of the tomato. You can store tomatoes in the freezer just by coring them and placing them whole into a freezer bag or a container. Just seal it, label it, freeze it, and there you go. The cool thing about this is when you decide that you want to use them, the skins just slip right off when they start to thaw. You can just, run it under the water and whoop, there it goes. So this is a great way to save your tomatoes if you have too many coming on at once, but you don't have time to can them up. I don't have time to be canning my sauces or my stewed tomatoes or anything else during the busiest part of our season. So I throw them whole into bags in the freezer, and then I process them later on. So otherwise, yeah, you absolutely can, can them up as stewed tomatoes or as a sauce or whatever to continue to enjoy that fresh from the garden flavor all winter long. But other than that, yeah, freezing them works absolutely great. So that's the down and dirty on tomatoes. I hope that gave you a good jump on the season and being able to go and get those favorites into your garden this season. If you have tips or tricks for pruning or trellising or storing your tomatoes that I didn't touch on today, send me a message. Let me know. I would love to share it with everybody else. We'll put it in the Facebook group. We'll post it on Instagram. Tell me your tomato growing secrets. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon.